Hello, everyone, and welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, Nubia's Ancient Treasures, we are joined by Denise M. Doxey, the curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and the visiting curator for the exhibition that is currently on view at the museum titled Nubia, Treasures of Ancient Africa. Thanks so much for being with us today, Denise.
Thank you very much. And thanks all of you who are listening. It's interesting that the title of this series at St. Louis is Art Speaks, because in the case of Nubia, art really has to speak, because the Nubians left frustratingly few written records. So we rely almost exclusively on the art and archaeology of Nubia to know anything about it. Nubia has a very long history, and the objects in this exhibition span about 2,000 years of that history, from about 1700 BC to the mid-3rd century AD. The exhibition includes about a little over 300 objects spanning this period. So what I'm going to try to do for the next half hour or so is to give you a whirlwind tour of ancient Nubia. Nubia, unlike its neighbor Egypt, is very poorly understood by most people. And in fact, most people don't even know it exists, which is shocking given the fact that it was one of the great powerful kingdoms of antiquity. But just to put it on the map for you, what we call Nubia today was not called Nubia in antiquity, it was called Kush. And it spans the Nile Valley from about Aswan in the north to Khartoum in the south, or possibly even farther south than that. But so it's basically southern Egypt and northern Sudan. The economy of ancient Nubia relies on really three major factors, one of which is animal husbandry. They were semi-nomadic herders of cattle and goats. But what really put them on the world stage was their place in trade. The capital cities of Nubia throughout its history all are found in places where trade routes from West Africa, Central Africa, and the Red Sea meet the Nile Valley, allowing them to control the trade of exotic materials that were highly desired in Egypt and the Mediterranean world. And here on the left, you see a group of Nubians arriving at the court of King Tutankhamun in the 18th dynasty. The primary export and the primary economic advantage that Nubia had, though, was gold. And the man in the center on the slide, who is carrying these rings on a tray, those are actually gold ingots. On the right is a pendant from the 8th century BC that is made out of a naturally occurring alluvial gold nugget, the kind that you would pick up if you were panning for gold. But this is an extremely large example, weighs 50 grams, and it's left in its original form with the exception of the addition of this bale that allowed it to be worn as a necklace. And I'm told that the same type of necklaces were worn during the gold rush the 18th century. Everything in the exhibition comes from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which has the largest and most important collection of ancient Nubian art anywhere outside of Sudan. And that is thanks largely to the work of this man, George Andrew Reisner. And here on the left, you see him excavating one of the tombs that we'll be talking about later, some of the objects that are actually in the exhibition. Now, Reisner was a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts. He was also a professor at Harvard University, and he headed up what was known as the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition to Egypt. At that time, Sudan was under the control of what we call the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. So it tended to be thought of as just a sort of a derivative part of Egypt at the time. Now, Reisner was brilliant as an archaeologist, and he was really ahead of his time in using new technologies, notably photography. He was one of the first people to use it extensively in the field. He kept meticulous records. But unfortunately, as a human being, he was not ahead of his time at all. He was born in 1867, so we're 2 years after the Civil War. And his social attitudes were very much a product of his day. His writings now seem egregiously racist and egregiously sexist. And this is another reason why Nubia, I think, is not better understood and appreciated today, because these early excavators tended to think of Egypt as part of the Mediterranean world and therefore sort of Western civilization, where they thought of Nubia as part of Africa, which was automatically substandard. The other issue with Reisner is that he came from a background in Egyptology, so he could read ancient Egyptian. The Egyptians were rivals, at times enemies of the Nubians. They were competing for the same resources, and the Egyptian texts refer to the Nubians in always derogatory ways. This is true of all of their neighbors, not exclusively Nubia. But when you read an Egyptian text, you almost never find a reference to Kush that is not modified by some adjective such as wretched or vile. So this dovetailed with Reisner's own racism and led him to see Nubia as inferior to Egypt. And this colored his interpretations. Ironically, his beautifully kept records and excavation reports have allowed scholars since his time to reevaluate his excavations and find that he was wrong about many things. So Reisner was fortunate in that he excavated at the royal cemeteries adjacent to the capital cities of Kush during the three greatest periods of its power. The first that he excavated, and also the earliest, was the site of Kerma. And here you see on the left the city of Kerma, centered around a large temple. And this was a massive, sprawling city. Reisner didn't actually excavate in the city, he excavated in the cemeteries. So he had no idea of the extent of this city, because all he could see was this one temple. But on the right, you see the tomb of one of the latest kings of the Kerma period, around 1550 BC, with its own mortuary temple in the background. But this is a tumulus, as we call it. It's a mounded tomb supported by mud brick walls. And the diameter of this circle is about the size of a football field. So it's a really massive tomb. Now, it's also nothing like tombs in Egypt, which should have given Reisner his first clue that he was not dealing with an Egyptian civilization. Another big difference between Egyptian material and Nubian material in the Kerma period is the burial methods. In Egypt, they would be mummified and buried in a rectangular coffin. In Kerma, they were buried, curled up on their sides, either on an animal hide, or in the case of the very most elite people who could afford it, on these very finely made funerary beds, the footboards of which were decorated with inlays of animals made of ivory. The bed that you see here on the left is actually a modern reproduction of one of these beds, because the frames almost never survived intact. But on the right, you see the actual ivory inlays from one of these beds, which feature animals, both actual animals that one might see in the Nile Valley, like the gazelle or the hyena, but also mythical, fantastic animals like this goddess Taweret in the center, who is a protective goddess. That's why she's wielding a big knife with the body of a hippopotamus and the spine and tail of a crocodile. Animals, in fact, play a very significant role in Nubian art throughout its history, but in particular at Kerma, because during the Kerma period, we have no representations of gods or kings or queens in human form, but we do have many representations of animals, including particularly powerful animals such as lions, hippos, bulls, rams. And this lion that you see here on the right is one of two lions that flanked the entrance to this mortuary temple that you see back here on the left. It's made of a material called faience, which was a very popular material in both Egypt and Nubia. And it's a glazed ceramic that contains either copper or copper ore. And when it's fired, that copper ore rises to the surface and forms this shiny blue glaze. And you'll see a lot of this in the exhibition. Animals also appear on pottery from this period, such as the ram's-headed bowl in the middle. But particularly characteristic of Kerma pottery, which Reisner rightfully called the finest ever produced in the Nile Valley, is this very hard-walled finely handmade blacktop red pottery. Notably, these cups, they're very distinctive to Kerma. Another material that is unique to Kerma is glazed quartz. The same type of a glaze that was used with the faience was used to coat quartz beads. In the case of the belt on the left, left in its natural state, but in the necklace on the right, you see globular or spherical beads made of quartz that are coated with the same material. And what's interesting about this is that it's a very difficult technique, that it's very hard to get a fire hot enough to fuse the glaze, but without cracking the quartz crystals themselves. So it's a very laborious process, but they mastered it and used it for all sorts of different beaded clothing, beaded necklaces, and headbands, and it's thousands of these beads have been found. So far we haven't seen anything that looks Egyptian, but then you come to something like this. This statue is clearly Egyptian. It's inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's a very common type of statue in Egypt. And a number of these were found in the royal tombs at Kerma, including some colossal examples. In some cases, the names of the officials are preserved, and they're people that were known to have lived in Egypt. They also appear in the Egyptian record. So this led Reisner to the miscalculation that this was actually an Egyptian outpost, that the large mud brick temples were fortresses manned by Egyptians and under an Egyptian governor. In fact, he had it backwards. These statues predate the tombs in which they were found by several hundred years. And they actually most likely came to Kerma, not because Egyptians brought them there, but because Kerma successfully waged attacks on southern Egypt and brought them back as trophies. So instead of being evidence of the Egyptian dominance of Kerma, they are in fact evidence of Kerma, not, I would say, dominance of Egypt, but certainly presenting a serious threat to Egypt. Eventually, the Kermans pushed their luck a little too far, and the Egyptians retaliated and took over the territory formerly occupied by Kerma and ruled there for about 500 years. So I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about the Egyptian material in the exhibit, but suffice it to say that there was a great deal of interaction between the Egyptians and Nubians at this time. Nubians living in Egypt, Egyptians living in Nubian, intermarriage, many exchanges of religious ideas and iconography. So by the time the Egyptians lost control of the Kerma's territory, many of the elite Nubians had adopted some Egyptian habits, and vice versa. So the bulk of the exhibition covers what we call the Napatan period, which takes its name from the ancient capital city of Napata, which is today at Jebel Barkal. Jebel Barkal, which you see on the right here, is a massive stone outcrop that just dominates the flat desert around it. And at one end, there is a pinnacle that looks something like a rearing cobra. Now, the Nubians and the Egyptians before them, in all likelihood, believed that this was the residence of the god Amun of Napata, who was the principal god of their pantheon. He was adopted from Egypt. And over the centuries, the various kings of Napata built a series of temples, one on top of the other. And it remained the most sacred site in Nubia throughout the rest of its history. The kings were buried nearby in cemeteries with pyramids. And in fact, there are more pyramids in Nubia than there are in Sudan than there are in Egypt today. A little known fact. And here's Reisner's camp at the cemetery at Nuri. From the temple complex at Jebel Barkal, we have a series of statues of kings of this period. This is a period in which initially the Nubians conquered the Egyptians. The Egyptians of southern Egypt, like the capital of Thebes, the sanctuary of Amun of Thebes, were closer to the Nubian kings of Jebel, or priests at Jebel Barkal, so that when civil war broke out in Egypt, they actually asked the Nubians for help. And under King Pianki, this is not Pianki, this is one of his successors, the Nubians conquered Egypt and ruled it for about a century. This is King Sekhameniskin, and he's one of the kings who actually no longer was in control of Egypt, but they still showed themselves with Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions. And this is very important because Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions can be read. So finally, we actually have the Nubians' view of their own history in a language that can be read. Now, Sekhameniskin lived right after Nubia was no longer in charge of Egypt, but he shows the standard iconography of a Nubian king, which is rather Egyptian in pose and an Egyptian style kilt, but a very distinctive headdress, which is a sort of close-fitting cap with double uraeus cobras on the front and streamers down the back. And the areas that are now rough and unfinished would originally have been gilded. So you can imagine how dramatic these statues would have been. From the tombs of the queens of this period, which will be actually the topic of the Art Speaks webinar next month, we have a wide variety of jewelry. Most of the tombs were, in fact, all of the tombs were robbed, I should mention, but here and there are some grave robbers missed things. And this gives us just a little glimpse of what may originally have been in these tombs. So we have these large faience pectorals. These are all meant to be worn on necklaces, showing various gods and goddesses. These two goddesses, we don't know who they are, but they're definitely unlike anything that you would see in Egypt. And they probably have a solar connotation based on their headdresses, which have sun discs. And they have these very curvy, voluptuous bodies, which is the aesthetic of we also have some really magnificent gold work. It's no mistake that the Nubians had a great source of gold, and they also really knew how to use it to its most benefits. In the case on the left-hand side, we have Amen in the form of a ram-headed sphinx sitting atop a column, which is decorated with cloisonné decoration. And on the right is a crystal amulet with topped by the head of the goddess Hathor, who was another goddess adopted from Egypt. And I will be talking about this at the next Art Speak, so I'm not going to dwell on them now, but it's a magnificent object, and it's actually only about an inch tall. So if you go to the exhibition, keep an eye out for it. Easy to miss. Another spectacular piece of metal work, this is actually electrum, a gold and silver alloy, is a collar that was made for one of the queens. And it's made in two parts with very delicate wire hinges. And here we have a winged solar god kneeling. And around the edges are notched wires that look like little braided wires, which is a technique that was long thought not to exist this far back in antiquity. These are from the 7th century BC. Stoneworking was another area in which the Nubian artists excelled. And this is a little ointment jar in the form of a bound oryx. And the spout, his mouth, would have been corked to keep the ointments from spilling out. But when it's not in use, the bound legs form a nice base. And when it is in use, they form a nice handle by which to lift it. So it's not only a very endearing image, but it's a very cleverly designed object as well. Now, you saw this picture earlier, and if you're wondering what these objects are spread out all over the desert, they are Shwabti figures, all belonging to King Taharqa. Now, in the exhibit, Taharqa was the most powerful king in Nubian history. And under his control, under his reign, the Nubians controlled not only Egypt, but they were also involved in the Sinai and the Near East, where they came into contact with the Assyrians. And Taharqa is even mentioned in the Bible. But he had more than 1,000 of these in various shapes and sizes in his tomb. Shawabtis are something that originated in Egypt, but in Egypt they were used by anybody who could afford them. And they tend to be, during this period, rather small and usually made of faience. But the Nubians made them in various different materials. And they seem to have served a different function for the Nubians as well, because they're strictly limited to royal tombs. And they're found placed very carefully around the perimeter of the sarcophagus. So in Egypt, they were thought to be servant figures for the deceased if they were called upon to do labor in the afterlife. But in Nubia, they seem rather to have been guardian figures. Beside the royal pyramids at the cemeteries outside Napata were little, or not so little, but chapels that were made of sandstone or mud brick in some cases. And they were meant to house offering cult of the deceased kings. So they could be entered afterward, after the king's death and burial, so people could make offerings. And this is a stela and an offering table belonging to a king named Espelta, and you'll be seeing more of him. And it shows the king worshiping the god Osiris, who's another Egyptian import. And here at the base is a offering table, big, very large granite offering table, which is decorated with images of food. And the idea is that by pouring a libation into this offering table, it would ceremonially, ritually create food for the king to enjoy in perpetuity. Also from the tomb of Espelta is this treasure of gold and silver objects. And this is what Reisner is in the process of excavating. Most of these tombs were completely robbed, but in this case, a ceiling slab had fallen and the tomb robbers missed. There are 8 pairs of these huge, oversized tweezers in gold and silver. This wonderful pitcher, which is actually formed from, aside from the handle, from one single piece of gold. And these enigmatic objects, no one knows what they are. They're cylinders that are decorated with winged goddesses and various other figures, rams and serpents, and they're hollow. And they have a flat bottom, and they must have been designed to hold something, but no one knows exactly what. So they're called cylinder seals, or cylinder sheaths. This object comes from the tomb of one of the successors of Espelta, and this was probably originally attached to his mummy wrappings. And we know that because of where it was found in the tomb, but also because these little tabs that enabled it to be sewn onto a fabric. And it shows the goddess Isis, that's her name on her head, that hieroglyph. And she is protecting the king with outstretched wings. And this is made in a repoussé technique in which the gold is pressed out from the back. And then details are finely chased or etched into the side, into the gold from the front. And in her hands, she's holding a hieroglyph. This hieroglyph is the hieroglyph for breath. And this is the hieroglyph for life. So she's saying, symbolically giving the king the breath of life so that he can be reborn in the afterlife. We have 2 mirrors coming from royal tombs that are about a century apart, but they look very similar in style, with gods or goddesses arranged around a column. This one is gilded silver with a copper mirror, which would have been shiny when it was new. And the one on the right-hand side is silver. The one on the left is decorated with a queen and 3 goddesses. The one on the right, a king and 3 gods. By about the 4th century BC, the capital of Nubia moved from Napata to Merowe. And Reisner also the Merowe. There's not a civilization. It's just that we start calling it the Merowe period because the cemeteries are at Merowe, but it's a continual
Denise,
cycle of kings.
Denise, I apologize for stopping you.
Yes.
You cut out a little bit there. If you could just repeat what you were just saying there, I just want to make sure that people.
Okay.
I apologize.
Can you hear me? Am I okay now?
Yes. Yeah. It's just the connection sometimes garbles things up. So I just wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Okay. The capital in the 4th century BC moved south to the site of Merowe. And this was the last of the 3 royal cemeteries where Reisner excavated. There's not actually a break in the line of kings. It's just a matter of the capital moved for whatever reason. In the Meroitic period, potters became principal artists again, as they had been in Kerma, but it was a very different style of paint, bright orange and red and black decoration, and some very fanciful imagery on it. And in this case, a series of crocodiles biting each other's tails. And below them is a grapevine. Grapevines are not native to Nubia. They are, but wine was a major import from the Mediterranean world. So the cult of the god Dionysus came with it, and the wine became an important part of their ritual. They probably also like drinking it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of written records from ancient Nubia. For the Meroitic period, in fact, we do. But unlike the Napatan period, the Meroitic people wrote in their own script. And unfortunately, while the sounds of the symbols are able to be understood, the grammar is not. So once again, we're somewhat in the dark about the viewpoints of the Nubians themselves. We can read people's names, place names, but we can't actually read the nouns or the verbs, so that we can't really tell what's going on in these texts. And here you see the script here. This part has an Egyptian inscription, but this is the offering table and a stele of a prince named Tedekin. Jewelry from Meroe is really unparalleled. They've mastered a number of different enameling techniques. This bracelet here is multicolored enamel surrounding appliques of gold. And some of the enameling techniques that were used in Nubia were actually not thought to have been invented until medieval Europe. This necklace is on the left is a very typical type of bead found at Meroe. They're hollow gold beads, often very complex decoration, and strung in this case with beads of carnelian. And if you look very, very closely, you can see there's a ram head surmounted by a human head. And this represents Amun-Ra as a ram and his consort Mut as a human. We have a wide variety of rings and earrings. The rings, the most popular type, are these intaglio rings made of, they're seal rings made of gold and silver. But earrings come in a wide variety and often have enamel decorations, such as the ear stud that you see on the right. Some examples of other types of earrings that we have, here's the ear stud again, but we also have pendant earrings and some very elaborate earrings, such as this on the far right, which shows the head of the goddess Hathor. And it's decorated not only with enamel at the top, but also granulation, in which minute little globules of gold are soldered onto a background. Now I look at these pendants hanging down now and then look like little COVID viruses, but they're meant to be floral motifs. Now during this Meroitic period, particularly in the centuries AD, Egypt had been conquered long ago by the Greeks and then later by the Romans. And this brought Meroe very closely into the world of the Mediterranean. Rome was a major trading partner. And we know from classical inscriptions that Greeks and Romans visited Meroe and were very impressed by it. They present the Nubians as great scholars and Herodotus calls them the most beautiful people in the world. So unlike the Egyptian image of the Nubians, the classical image is really quite different. So here on the left, we have one of a series of these lamps that are very similar to lamps that are found in the Roman world. So it's possible that it's an import from Rome. On the other hand, it has a Meroitic inscription on it. So it might be a local reproduction. And these, when lit, would have cast fantastic shadows. This griffin handle, for example, would be reflected in the, if you can imagine, the fire casting shadows of this mythical beast. Now on the right-hand side, we have a silver goblet, which is a type that is also well known in Rome. And this is certainly an import, and it's possibly a gift to the royal court of Meroe from Nero, who is known to have sent a delegation to Meroe. And this could well be a gift to the rulers of Meroe at the time. Interestingly, the Romans never conquered Meroe or Nubia at all. They conquered most of the known world, including Egypt, but when they got to the border of Nubia, they ended up, after a brief period of warfare, making a truce with the queen of Nubia, the ruling queen of Nubia. So we say, Augustus could take over everybody, but he couldn't take over the African queen. So they were friends thereafter and trading partners. And probably no surprise that both cultures come to their sort of end about the same time. And that's, in a nutshell, a quick 2,000-year history of ancient Nubia. Thank you.
Okay, are you ready for some questions? Thank you.
Sure.
Great. So let's see. Someone would like to know what is the status of museums in Sudan today?
Today, most of the material, the major museum is the Sudan National Museum in Khartoum. But there are also regional museums. There's a very nice little museum at Kerma. And it's interesting that the statues like the King Senkamaniskan that I showed earlier that were found at Jebel Barkal, as a very similar group of statues showing the same kings was also found up near Kerma. So unbeknownst to Reisner at the time, Kerma actually was also an important center later on in Nubian history as well. But so there's so many excavations going on that every year the history of Nubia changes because something new is found. And it's just almost hard to keep up with. And of course, now the excavators are using techniques that Reisner couldn't even have imagined, like drones and satellite imagery and ground penetrating radar. And so there's still activity going on at all of these sites and many others.
Yeah, great. That sounds cool. Someone else would like to know, were any canopic jars found in the Nubian tombs?
Yes. In fact, there are some of them in the exhibition. The Napatan period in particular, which was really the time when Nubian burial customs were the closest they ever would be to Egyptian burial customs, because they were, first Egypt was in charge of Nubia and then Nubia was in charge of Egypt. So there was a lot of cultural exchange. So the kings and queens pyramid at the earliest royal cemetery, the later royal cemetery of Napata at Nuri were found with very large canopic jars. It seems as though the Nubians, I think, were kind of like Texas. If the Egyptians did it, they did it bigger and more. It was, and it's the same as true with the Swabtis. They have thousands of them, and they're all big, and they're made of, well, not all big, but it's like, and the little heart scarabs that the Egyptians used, and there's also some of these in the show, tended to be, about 2 inches, and the Nubians adopted those that made them, 4 inches. And
a little bit of competition.
Yes. Little one-upmanship.
Right. Let's see. So there are a couple of questions, and I know this gets pretty deep. So a couple of questions asking, what race were the Nubians, and were the Nubians racially distinct from Egyptians? Like, has DNA analysis been possible?
That's an excellent question, because we actually, in the exhibition, there is a video presentation with a biologist named Shamarka Kaita, who works at Smithsonian, and he is a specialist in ancient DNA. And there is no difference between Egyptian and Nubian DNA. So they were probably, his point is that the whole concept of race is something that is a post-colonial invention, that in the ancient world, race wouldn't have been a factor. And of course, now there's a wide variety of different skin colors and hair textures within Egypt and Sudan. So probably the farther south you got, the darker skinned people got, but there wasn't a racial distinction. I think that's something that the early excavators of the 20th century sort of removed Egypt from Africa and thought of it as a separate race, but the ancient Egyptians, if you were Nubian, but you spoke Egyptian, dressed Egyptian, they would have considered you an Egyptian. In fact, it's an interesting juxtaposition of what the royal propaganda of the Egyptians says about the Nubians and what is actually known from reality. Because, for example, in the 18th dynasty, when Egypt was in control of Nubia, they always talking about vile, wretched Cush, and their king is always shown bashing them on the heads, and the gods are described as one who tramples vile Cush. But in reality, we know that they're under the very kings that are doing this. We have Nubians who are high up in the administration, and even one that was known to have been buried in the Valley of the Kings. So the actual day-to-day life of these people was very different than what the royal iconography would lead you to believe.
Right. Oh, interesting. Okay, let's see. Let's do one more question. How did religions from different regions, especially Greek and Roman, play into the artwork in Nubia? Did they adopt a lot of different gods or goddesses from different areas?
From Egypt, they adopted quite a few. What's interesting about the Egyptian gods that were adopted in Nubia is they tend to be the ones that also have animal forms. So I think that goes back to even in Kerma, where Amen takes the form of a ram, which he then does in Egyptian art, or Hathor can take the form of a cow. From Greek and Roman world, we don't have as many. Notably, the one god that you really find in Meroe, for example, is Dionysus, and that definitely goes hand in hand with the wine imports. The wine was believed to be a very sort of, it was an import. It was also, ritually, and I'm sure it was intoxicating, and that certainly we know in Egyptian religion, drunkenness played a big part. May have done so in Nubia as well.
I have a very quick and easy question that you can answer. Can you spell Meroe for someone?
Meroe.
Okay, thank you.
I'm always curious with the closed captioning and these things, what they turn these sites into, because they're not something the closed captioning will recognize.
Yes, we have learned that. So I will say, always take the auto live captioning with a grain of salt, because what it hears is not usually what it ends up saying. So
yeah, I should have put captions in these so that you can.
Well, that just means they have to come see the exhibition so that they can see it all in person. So we encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to come. It's a wonderful, wonderful exhibition. Well, thank you so much, Denise. And I will, as you mentioned, there is going to be another Art Speaks specifically about this show that Denise will do for us, and that'll be on June 10th. It'll also be at noon. That's currently up on the website, so if you want to register to do that, that would be great. We also, next week, if you are interested in joining me next week on Wednesday, May 19th at noon, to hear Slam archivist Jenna Stout, curator Amy Torbert, and conservator Courtney June Book speak about the history of the murals in Gallery 203 that will soon be under conservation this summer at the museum. So I encourage you to go find that. So thanks a lot, Denise, and thanks to everybody who was here. Have a good day.
Thanks. Goodbye.